One, two, three. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Mike, I stole all your Kit Kats. I just need chocolate. I stole all his Kit Kats.
Okay, great to see everybody here today. This is fulfilling. Huh? It's a full house, isn't it? Well, at least it's not raining. So welcome everyone, and Daniel, Justine, all over to you.
Great to see a full house today, and everyone's done their pre-reading for a spot quiz on the conditions of our bylaw. Joined today by Justine and also Henry in the public gallery, her little boy. We're here to talk about the local waters bylaws. My role will be to facilitate some of the discussion. Ultimately, Justine's done a lot of that work in the thinking in the background. We're here today to really talk about the process around combining of bylaws, and we'll talk to some of the examples, particularly around the trade waste, but also around the inability to disconnect stormwater bylaws to wastewater bylaws when we have people pumping stormwater into wastewater systems and causing issues, and how we kind of join together all that thinking. Justine will also talk us through the current context around the fact that our wastewater bylaw is lapsed and we don't actually have an existing stormwater bylaw. So now it's very much an appropriate time to have that discussion. Today was really around sharing the work that's been done in the background, a few of the decision points that are looming, but it's really more around in terms of the no, see, do, providing an update on the work that's happening and just trying to test elected members' understanding of the work that's going to commence and the timeframes around that. So we've got a number of questions that we'll sort of circle back to at the end, and ideally through the conversation today we'll cover these off, which is around should we continuing drafting the one local waters bylaw. So officers obviously have a firm view around the benefits of combining, certainly wanting to ensure that there's some understanding of that approach today, agreeing with the purpose of the local waters bylaw, so just ensuring there's an understanding of where decision points are made, that it's not a silver bullet to address all of our problems, where we see an issue around setting council position, for example, in the rural properties where existing bylaws might conflict with other areas in our district plan around connecting to, say, wastewater trickle feed, water supply trickle feed. We'll be really clear in this bylaw review whether that decision will be made in advance of the bylaw and that'll be actually sitting there as a tool, or whether there's a separate process that sits outside that. So we're clear ourselves in terms of our policy, but also we're clear with the development community in that aspect in terms of how the decision-making process was made. So we'll then really do a little bit more of a refined focus today on the wastewater component and the trade waste component, expecting the trade waste to draw more questions and queries, and we'll look to close that out today just to assist with our bylaw development process. That there'll be a little bit of a refined focus around those two elements today. On that note, I will hand over to Justine.
So the first thing that we're here to discuss today is whether we should be combining all our local waters bylaws into one larger combined bylaw. So HDC has a current water supply bylaw that's due for review or a new bylaw to come in place in 2025, and that's the same with our trade waste bylaw, so it's due to be reviewed next year. So we do not have a current wastewater bylaw at the moment. It has been automatically revoked as it wasn't reviewed within the required time frame, so it was revoked in 2022. When we also do not have a stormwater bylaw, so there's never been one in place. What we've found as we've started looking at these is that each bylaw is actually really intrinsically linked to the others. So for example, when we look at wastewater is the larger component, and then trade waste is one part of wastewater. So it's actually really difficult to split the thinking around those two bylaws. We've also found, as we've started reviewing some of the bylaws, that we have definitions that might be slightly different in each of the bylaws, and given that we're looking at the same or water supply services, we should really have the same definitions being consistent across all of them. And one of the biggest risks that we can actually see is that if we don't think about these bylaws together when we're reviewing them, is that we may end up with something missed that sort of falls in between the cracks of the different components. We also think that, for example, when looking at them all together will mean that we can make sure we're addressing all the risks that are there. So, for example, one of the biggest risks for stormwater is that trade waste is being discharged into it. And it means also that we can look forward into the future and make sure that we are consistently applying the rules across all our different water services. Okay, so on to the next component, which is where we want to have a look at today at the purpose of the Local Waters Bylaw. So where we've got these components from, it's actually based on the previous bylaws where we've had them, and also adding in some officers' thinking as part of this. So the reason we're looking for an integrated approach is that we would like to develop an integrated and holistic approach to managing local waters. So that's water supply, stormwater, wastewater and trade waste, that recognises the interdependencies between each component and promotes their sustainable use and management. So again, using all the same definitions across all water services to make it more user-friendly. The next component is actually to look at preventing damage to the environment. An environment in this context is in the widest definition. It's to appropriately manage water supply, wastewater, trade waste and stormwater to prevent damage or adverse effects occurring to both the built and natural environment. So also looking at the flooding in our urban areas and that kind of thing. The next one that we have here is managing changing environmental conditions. So to support growth in the region through the provision and protection of local waters infrastructure to ensure that levels of service can remain consistent, and allow continued service in the face of changing environmental conditions and regulatory events. What we also have within this area is some changing regulatory conditions as well. So we have things on the horizon like changing requirements for granny flats, and how this may impact this. Questions?
Hi, can I just ask, I'm not up to speed on it, but the yet to be determined new structure of a type of CCO that will manage our water, and whether we're with one council or 5 others and we all might have different bylaws, how and whose rules trump what and in which order, because we could do a whole lot of work and it might look different to another council, and all of a sudden we're in one big group and managing those who has the authority and what that looks like and how that flows down. Can I just get a bit of understanding there?
Yeah, in some ways, I suppose, really wanted to reiterate today that back in 2018 or 2020, we didn't go through the process that we currently are in to actually look at that holistic. We didn't, in fact, go through a process to review our wastewater bylaw. So in which case it has lapsed, and push comes to shove. We've made decisions through the long-term plan around increasing our revenue for trade waste collection. When we start to look at the volume of customers, and as we've done research across the country, which is the work that Justine's been doing, that's starting to inform this holistic approach. We expect that as we merge into another entity, be it a Horowhenua Kapiti or a Wellington or Manawhanui, that the work that we're doing now will stand us in a good place to either lead or merge with those new entities in terms of who holds the regulatory stick. With the future entity, that's probably a kind of a separate discussion, but in some ways it's just uncovering some of those ground rules and the issues of today that will still be issues in the future that we're trying to resolve and provide some clarity around. So I think that acknowledge there's it always feels like there's never a perfect time. Perhaps 3 years ago we were in a similar position thinking, well, there's a reform coming, perhaps we should wait and we can use this national best practice bylaw process that's been developed. That obviously hasn't been released officially, but we have been working with some of the people that have developed that, and they've been able to share some of that thinking to shape our thoughts. So it's Justine may want to add to that, but there's never a perfect time, but we've tried to capture some of the work that was done at that more global thinking level through the Three Waters reform.
The legislation's not actually clear yet, Councillor Tukapoa, on whether the council would still hold the bylaw, because if it's a council-owned organisation, unless through the legislation, unless the council-owned organisation is given powers through legislation to have a bylaw, it will still require councils, which is different to under the former government's model. The entities were going to be given power in that legislation to have bylaws. So it's a little bit, we don't know is the answer. But just to Daniel's point, Morrison Lowe did a lot of work for DIA on building a template on what a national bylaw could be for the Three Waters, and so that they've been supporting Justine and providing guidance around how do we take the best bits out of that, so that wherever it does land, we've kind of protected and positioned that.
Yeah, and before we sort of get too far down the path to a point of being prepared to go out to community consultation, today was really an important check-in point, just to sort of set the scene around where we have been, really the scope of the focus. This first section is very much around informing the thinking that we've done based on some best practice, noting that there'll be some opportunities to feedback and some questions around real examples, which we may have a question from Kat.
Dan, how does this work stream tie in with the work stream around developing the vesting policy? Because some of these bylaws have touch points into vested assets, right? And so the idea would be we'd want to make sure that all of the vesting policy approach is captured in the policy, and that these bylaws only have enforcement tools to ensure effective or efficient operation of vested assets, like if you need access to land or property or whatever. But can you just, are they going to kind of progress at the same time so that there's obviously talking to each other?
Yeah, you've jumped forward to slide 17, which obviously after we cover these scopes, there's a signal to that, but ensuring that we don't try and resolve everything through the bylaw and use that as that silver bullet, that if there's a vesting policy that's going to be developed to address that very issue, then we should be really articulate that really well in the bylaw, that don't look for the bylaw for the answers, and we don't attempt to do a half-by job of resolving that and then have a lot more advanced work on a vesting policy that then conflicts. And it's the same case with the water main connection, that one part of our policy might say, you might be able to do it. One part saying no new rural connections. We're probably stepping back a further step to say, actually, perhaps we need a holistic conversation and a council position on that. And it might be that then gets embedded into the bylaw or a separate part of our policy framework, but we're using the bylaw to throw up all of those examples and ensure the decisions are either have been made and we're documenting them, or signalling to future decisions that will need to be made.
Great. So the next point that's on here is making sure that we operate within our resource consent conditions. So council's responsible for ensuring that our local waters activities meet the required standards set out in the applicable resource consents. If we don't meet these standards, council and indirectly the community may face enforcement action, including fines and potential prosecution. And that's where we just need to make sure that we have all the tools that we need to be able to make sure that we can meet those conditions. The next point is protect public health. So we want to prevent drinking water contamination and wastewater overflows. So this protects all community members, including those who are vulnerable and those whose work is associated with the wastewater system. Next, we want to protect local waters assets. So we want to prevent damage caused both accidentally and through misuse to public and private infrastructure to ensure consistent provision of services to appropriate service levels. Fair and transparent cost allocation. So we want to provide a system where the costs associated with the increased requirement for services, for example, in trade waste or stormwater, are equitably shared. Appropriate service levels. So we want to manage local water services demand in relation to council's ability to provide appropriate levels of service for the community. So this will include ensuring that water supply remains above the required levels and wastewater requirements do not exceed council's service thresholds. And then lastly, we want to look at preventing water wastage. So we want to protect the water supply from leaks and water wastage to facilitate the provision of a consistent and reliable water supply for community use and prevent damage to the environment.
So that last few slides perhaps comes across as more of a lecture than an exercise in option development of some outcomes that have been sought. But what we've attempted to do is take that best practice around the logical outcomes that a bylaw should achieve based on our existing one, officer input and national best practice, and we've presented them to you in those subsequent slides. Alternative approach, we could have sat here with some sticky notes and we could have developed those up. This isn't your last chance to input to that today, but certainly, if we were to flick back to the previous slide, if there was any expectations that a bylaw should be achieving over and above this at a sort of principal outcome level, we'd be keen to hear that either now or as we close out the presentation, because in the next few slides we're going to step into some examples and some potential decision-making processes that'll be upcoming in that bylaw process. So this slide in front of you here is really just an overview of the outcomes that are going to be sought from that bylaw process.
What I was going to say, Dan, is just from looking at past examples, and it's probably covered by these, but making sure that the bylaw respects private property rights, but it also gives us the tools that we need when we need to go and deal with a worst case scenario. And so, for example, I think that for thinking about I&I in terms of giving us the power and ability to actually be able to go and do smoke testing or different so enforcement tools, but also actually inspection and testing type mechanisms and tools. So just making sure that the bylaw actually has those authorities to do those kind of things for those worst case scenarios.
The really kind of minute detail, but building renovations done, there's probably a level of trust that the plumbers connected the wastewater pipe up to the wastewater lateral. Often is the case, even on larger projects where we find stormwater pipes connected into wastewater mains or vice versa. So, almost as a right, providing council, that power to, use judgment as to when inspections are required, over and above perhaps what would be done now, and that would just be around identified risks and then having the power to then take action. In the example you've given, yeah.
Right, so the next part that we'd like to talk to you about today is the wastewater part of the bylaw, or the wastewater bylaw. So this part of the bylaw aims to provide a safe and efficient wastewater system, protect the wastewater system from damage, misuse and interference, protect the environment and the health and safety of persons from adverse effects of harmful substances being discharged, and ensure that private drains operate in an acceptable way. So again, this bylaw has been automatically revoked, but when officers reviewed it, we did find that the majority of the previous bylaw does still appear to be fit for purpose. So we are proposing to use that previous bylaw as a basis for this part of the combined bylaw. So the types of sections that we're looking to include information on is safe and efficient wastewater discharge, acceptance of wastewater discharge, approval to connect charges and points of discharge, works and activities in close proximity to the wastewater system, so that's where we want to make sure that it's happening an appropriate distance away from the wastewater system, prevention of groundwater and stormwater infiltration, preventing blockages, disconnection processes, preventing damage or obstruction, dealing with spills and adverse events, enforcement offences and penalties. So those are the types of areas that we're looking to enforce. So you can see from the image here, the one in the middle there is actually, that's from New Plymouth, and that is a combination of fat that's come from trade premises, but also from houses, and wet wipes. So this is the typical type of blockage that can happen in our wastewater network, and that's the type of thing we're really trying to prevent when we're putting these rules in place. So the suggested changes that we're looking at is we want to address some of the discrepancies between the district plan, the subdivision standards, the Building Act, and the bylaw that's there. The discrepancies that have kind of been a problem primarily relate to the size of pipes for connections. So what that's meant is that where we've typically had say a quarter-acre section where we've had one house on it, we've said that it can have a reasonably small pipe size. As we've increased the number of houses that we can have on that one area, how it works at the moment is that we could still have the same pipe size, but now it's actually servicing 6, 12 houses, however many is on that lot. That then means that it's more likely to have a blockage. So we just want to look at where we can make sure it's consistent between those different plans and acts. We also want to make sure that there's consistency with the development contributions policy. So we want to, again, improve consistency with that. Also looking at new legislative changes, including the proposals that are there at the moment to no longer require building or resource consent for granny flats. So we just want to make sure that everything is clear and consistent. The other part that we've got here is the requirement of council to accept assets. So for example, we want to look at who owns the pipes that serve more than 2 properties in the case of an infill subdivision, particularly if the pipes have ended up covered in concrete. So it is causing a bit of a problem at the moment, and we'd like to explore how we can address that. We also want to address damage caused by works in close proximity to pipes. So, for example, when fibre is being installed, it can go through, and it can actually go through our wastewater pipes at the moment, and so we want to prevent that happening, but we'd also like to look at adding in a clause where the person causing the damage is liable for the full cost of repairing and any other associated costs. The next point that's there, which we touched on before, which is when can council inspect pipes, so for example following renovations. Again, we just want to explore when can work be inspected by council and who has to rectify it if there is an issue that's been identified. And then lastly, we'd like to give some consideration to strengthening the requirements to access private properties for repair and maintenance of the network, and we'd also like to prevent public access to public assets, for example the wastewater treatment plants, which is there at the moment, but we'd like to strengthen that to protect health and safety and prevent damage. It's more about adding consistency with this between wastewater and water supply, because one of the areas that we would like to look at in the water supply is protecting the catchment areas above where water is taken from. At the moment, there's no people can just go into that area, and we would just like it to be consistent between everything to make sure that we are protected.
Yeah, and that's obviously an important topic for engagement as we move forward with our water supply bylaw, alongside iwi partner engagement in that space in terms of source water protection, given that we've got a range of different sources of our water supply. But around the wastewater, really the message of today is that the prospect of combining provides opportunities. Largely our revoked bylaw is in a reasonably good state. There's a range of inconsistencies that those kind of on the ground working, particularly in that development engineering space, and some of the sort of operational staff have identified that there's some anomalies, and it would be good for ourselves, but also the development community to have really clearly set out goalposts. Over is obviously into the just really bolstering our rights to ensure that when we need to act in an enforcement space or in a proactive manner, that we've got the tools to do so. So reasonably uneventful in terms of wastewater. Today was really, providing that framework, that there'll be some further touch points, but today was more of an opportunity for questions, more so around if you're surprised around things that aren't on the table for discussion today. So if you had expectations around the bylaw achieving other things, other work that we need to do, really, today's the opportunity to do that. Otherwise, in terms of the wastewater, it is fairly well a business as usual approach. The trade waste which is coming next. I can expect a different level of excitement around perhaps some of the opportunities and decisions that may sit in that space.
Can I just ask about flesh it out for me a bit more around the size of a pipe on private property in terms of, like you mentioned, 1/4 acre, it's got one house, and the end up might have 2 or 3. But I guess it's been, I've always understood all these building standards for a start, and things have to be a certain standard. But at what point is 2 or 3 dwellings sharing one wastewater pipe from their property out into the street or connecting onto ours, and where that blockage is, be it on their property, their problem, they pay for their plumber, versus the blockages happening down our street or at the plant. That's our problem, because how can you assert then telling them to increase the size of their pipe if you think to a point it's unreasonable? Like, yeah, and then that whole idea of, is it our pipe or is it theirs? Because there's concrete on it. I mean, it goes back to Sam's earlier point about vested assets and those standards. But if a pipe is under a driveway of theirs, or clearly within their boundary and not on our street, it's their pipe, their problem. Or is there some blurry lines here that I'm not aware of?
The question's probably a little bit blurry in terms of referencing. I think you've highlighted the fact that the Building Act, the subdivision design, there's actually an element of uncertainty when someone's turning up with a proposal for a granny flat or a 1 into 4, or perhaps something more significant in terms of really being quite clear in terms of how they can go about that, and so that's where that discrepancy comes in.
Oh, well, no, because the reference was there's a blockage in the pipe, so we want to tell them to build a bigger pipe, but if the blockage is on their land, it's their problem. They fix it, not us. So when it becomes our problem, isn't that what we're supposed to be fixing? I'm just trying to understand the difference.
That particular example, I think, is pretty clear cut. That if it's on private property, then that's the landowner's issue. Yeah.
So it's probably because in this scenario you're talking about, you're assuming willing compliance by the property owner to fix the problem, and so the bylaw has to cover situations where the landowner, for example, there might be a leak in the wastewater pipe on private property, which obviously has environmental impacts, and so the question is whether the bylaw should give us powers and ability to require them to fix and do things. Is that the...
I see. So you identify a problem, it's on their side of the fence, but you want to enforce them to fix it rather than say, hey, you need to fix it.
Yeah, so part of the problem that's there at the moment as well is that if we've, say, previously had one house there and now we've got 6, which house do we go to if we've got a blockage up at the start and then the 6 owners can't figure out what to do? We've then got a situation that you've got 5 other houses that can't use the service. And so we just want to be able to perhaps explore this a little bit more to be able to provide some advice about whether something needs to change in the bylaw. And to just make that consistency between these different plans, standards and acts, because at the moment there's a difference.
Yeah, so that example therefore is if they declared clarity that they were connecting to a shared pipe, all 5 or 6 of them, and so if there was a future problem that they're all responsible, if that's not clear, then yeah, you'd encounter this. Otherwise, they should all be connecting to us on their own to avoid that, or...
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point, and that's the issue with the misalignment of a district plan or a building act with a bylaw, is that in a space when the application arrives on the desk and there's a 20 working day window to turn that around, quite often there's a potential for that misunderstanding. The developer comes in and maybe we're saying on one hand yes this is okay, on the other hand we're saying it's not, and often the decision has to be made in quite a short space of time, and you're effectively picking one rule book versus the other. And so what we're attempting to do in this bylaw review is kind of roll through those scenarios and effectively understand the implication of those decisions at that development engineering stage. So because ultimately it falls back on council. The comment would be in 10 years' time council made the decision to allow this.
Yeah.
Now my property is flooded with wastewater.
So that,
What are you going to do about it? So that's
So that misalignment with the district plan and the developing piece. Would this bylaw, if we had these new rules or these ways of addressing what you've highlighted, would this then supersede the district plan or whatever to determine actually no, you have to ensure this happens, therefore that means X?
what we're wanting to achieve is to ensure we don't create more loopholes or disparity. We are going to, where there's clear direction from council being provided in the past in terms of policy setting by elected members around specific things that should be delivered or regulation that requires us, then we'll double down on that in this bylaw. Where there's an opportunity to decide on a path forward, we'll bring back a decision around that through this process, through the public engagement and ultimately decision making. And then ultimately, if there's a scenario that sits outside all of those three, where something should be directed to the subdivision standards and they need to be reviewed, or a vesting policy, we'll just ensure that we don't conflict with that in the bylaw. So when someone wants to go around and look at vesting of assets, it's likely that they'll be looking at a vesting policy. The bylaw will be very silent. We'll be directing that decision point to the vesting policy, and it's just really around creating consistency so that some of those that exist. There's probably not too many examples in the wastewater space, but as we jump into the water supply, it's how do we address some of those historic issues that we might have around 280 cross-lease connections, and we're going through a process to roll out water metering. Do we just connect to the one at the boundary where it's always, being the neighbours have been happy to turn the tap on and off, and it affects the neighbour and they let them know. All of a sudden, there's a leak that's on one neighbour's property. They don't want to fix it. They're getting a bill, and it starts to unravel a little bit more. So, there potentially will be some decision making around council actually intervening to resolve some of those historic issues that we'll encounter through this bylaw review. So there's a range of issues. I think the wastewater one is probably the hardest space to kind of the main things are quite obvious around. Logically, we shouldn't have the wastewater connected into a stormwater system, vice versa. But as we start to get in, you see the crossover between trade waste and wastewater. Examples with private properties that we aren't currently charging trade waste that are potentially impacting on our wastewater network, versus examples right at the bottom end where we've got trucked waste being tipped into our facility. There's sort of a range of more easily tangible examples in the trade waste space. So the wastewater, I think there's a few examples that we'll identify through the process, but it's not the sole focus of the bylaw review.
So, last question then. So this is wastewater, and there are examples around that have this shared pipe to a point. When we think of water supply, does the same kind of scenario exist for some places? Because that would mean that 5 or 6 share one water meter, and which house is using more than the other. I just want to be clear, does that not exist, or is in a similar way it does? One water meter for however many.
That is I think I'd read off the number. I think there's 280 that we've identified that there'll be a decision. We've scoped, the range of options. Does council go and put separate connections in, charge it back to the rates, on their rates over a period? Do we just do it in kind? Do we leave it to, there's a couple of different options that, there'll be a decision-making process around that. And really today was to highlight the fact that we've started that journey. We've done some research and we're trying to work from a top-down principle level in the wastewater space. It's thrown up a little bit of inconsistency, a couple of opportunities, but we're not seeing, a significant shift from the current bylaw. Whereas when we jump into the trade waste space, there's probably a little bit more room to move. And as you rightfully point out, the water bylaw, there'll be a similar decision-making process I expect around provision of water to rural areas, and then how do we address all the cross connections.
Hey guys, a couple of questions from me and a couple of comments probably. In regards to the trade waste, actually, I wanted to talk about, and I've done it before, I think. When I read the bylaw, it clearly identified about some of the, who is held accountable in regards to when things go wrong at the plant or something like that, where the waste is coming from. But I've raised previously about we don't track our waste. I want to relate it to recent conversations we had around solid waste and how we, in those workshops, you showed us how we potentially have backloads of waste coming from other districts coming back here. And I have a similar concern with trade waste, particularly of the trucking movements that you just spoke to earlier. And one of the things for me is, I liked what I heard earlier when someone said whoever creates the issue should pay for whatever's happened and whatever it is to remediate the issue, and not the district. But when we're not tracking waste, and when we've got a facility that has waste being dumped directly to it, and we don't understand what that waste is or the nature of the waste, we actually have no means of actually recovering anything if the waste that's contaminated the plant is coming from an untracked source. We can track everything coming from pipes. We know it's probably coming from homes. There's screening and all of that. But again, I'm just going to say that I didn't read and hear anything around how we are going to track waste, minimise importing liquid waste as an example. And why I say that is because the tipping fees across the region are so different. And I wonder whether this council should be considering a more consistent, higher dumping fee to actually stop people feeling like we're the cheapest district in the region to dump our waste, so therefore we'll just do a whole lot of backloads from other areas into this area. So that's something I would like to see captured somehow in here, because I think you've already confirmed to me we no longer have a waste track system. But I think we need our operators to absolutely be clear where the waste is being sourced, and when it is dumped in our facilities, that it is registered as coming from those sources, and any external waste coming into our region needs a different, for me, mechanism and charge. Because you're bringing waste that doesn't belong to this district into a plant that we are facilitating for our people, for our communities. The one around, the other one I picked up in there was the hazardous sites and storage facilities. I just wanted to know whether do we actually have that available to us or to our community? Like, are our community allowed to know where hazardous substances are stored within our district? Like, do our neighbours know that potentially there's a toxic chemical being stored next door to them, or a toxic waste of some sort? So I'm just wondering, do we actually have that type of a register, so we absolutely know where even temporary storage facilities, particularly our sewage operators that operate like that, do we have a register of them? So I just really want to understand how we manage that, and then how do we actually recover costings as such to allow them to operate like this and bring them into our plants. Thanks.
Everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me. And as we go through a couple more of these slides, we have some suggestions on things that we can bring in to address exactly those concerns that you've raised.
Team, just Pity and I were just having a quick conversation following on from the District Plan Steering Committee, where obviously one of the work streams there is more industrial commercial land, but I think we've also talked around this table before around that we would kind of like to discourage wet industries, because of the corresponding impact it has on both need for water supply, but also downstream management. And so the question is, obviously, we can influence that through district plan settings, but is there scope to include some settings in the bylaw that potentially disincentivize, is that right? Or puts an appropriate framework over the wet industries, perhaps signal that those aren't our preferred industries in terms of what we're trying to achieve in terms of that growth picture. It's probably more the framework around dealing with wet industries in terms of the corresponding impact they have on our networks. Is that something that could be looked at?
Yes, we can look at things like that. So I wonder if I just take us a quick step backwards in terms of the trade waste. So trade waste is one component of the wastewater. We have had an HDC bylaw in place for a really long time. I'm trying to find the original bylaw that's gone in place. The earliest one I can find is about 1991. So we've had trade waste bylaws in place since then. Part of what's, I guess, happened is that we have not necessarily operationalised the bylaw, and that is what we are looking to do in parallel to this process at the moment.
Let's just test this out. If we were interested in wet industries, I'd be interested to understand, do we have a register of existing? How much are they using, as in what comes in, but then equally what is going out? What are those measures? And if we were to say, okay, we're going to have potentially another fresh pork or live-in meats, and we kind of, based on that size, understand what they might use, or they might actually give us some indication of what they require. At that point, knowing where are we at, what capacity we have to even take that on board or not, and then in terms of our CapEx program, whether they'd even fit by X date. I don't know, without understanding that, because I don't want to be anti, but then I want to be realistic without the burden of how much that is ahead of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm keen to steer the conversation today around the trade waste bylaw, because as we were talking about the wet industry in a position, I probably felt that we haven't, as a council, come to a position around wet industry. If we look to what the Alliance Meats are doing around investigating, they've got their own sort of treatment plant, which is called a DAF, and they're looking at these things called reverse osmosis, where they can actually recycle all of that water that's used in treatment back into the washdown processes. So there's a whole lot of what is a wet industry becomes a much less wet industry. When we start to, I suppose, the first step in the process around our wastewater treatment plant is there'll be a paper coming to council at the next August council meeting, kind of in the lead up to making a decision around the long-term location of the live-in wastewater treatment plant. That will then lead into optioneering processes around the type of treatment plant, and at a high level, the outcome that you would get from the investment in a membrane plant versus alternative and emerging technologies. We're trying to not just look at what's happening within New Zealand at the moment, but sort of internationally around issues with PFAS and little micropolymers escaping into the environment. But there's a whole lot of other decisions that are linked with in the future. As of today, we don't have the capacity, but in the future, should we be planning for capacity for these wet industries? There's a whole lot of interlinking decisions, and I think it'd be good to document as we go through this, and then kind of put them in a box as to where we think those decisions lie. So that allows us to then continue on and achieve the good outcomes that we're seeking from the bylaw process. If that's helpful, that there's a there's a deeper story and more facts and figures we need to get on the table. And it sounds like a willingness for elected members to be in the see-do space around perhaps what might happen in that district plan development versus capacity and investment.
Yeah, I agree, John. That's just what my question was going to be. I mean, let's save that strategic discussion for another day and focus on the bylaw issues that we have to deal with. And this is the first time I ever heard that we're discouraging wet industries from this district as well. I think that's a much broader discussion to have and aligned to what sort of growth we want in this region as well. So, yeah, let's keep moving.
I just wanted to ask a bit of a risk-based question. Given that our bylaws have lapsed, have we undertaken any illegal enforcement of bylaws that aren't valid?
No, the trade waste one is still valid, and we're issuing permits. There's one that will be across my desk this week. But no, not currently. We're not currently in any enforcement action around the wastewater. But as we advance planning around the live-in stormwater consent, for example, I can expect that we might throw up areas of industry that are contributing to problems that ultimately fall back on council as we dig deeper into the implementation of the waste track system, where just this week where the wastewater operators are pulling samples of foaming out of the intake for the wastewater plant. We're working with the operators trying to understand the sources, and as we start to roll some of these out, then after investigation, education ultimately becomes enforcement. So because of where we've been as a council, in fact we've had a bylaw since 1991, we haven't even fully operationalised it. We haven't even really fulfilled our goal in terms of investigation, understanding, education before we even jump into that enforcement space. So yeah, ideally you'd have well-versed operational bylaws before we start throwing lawyers' letters around, but we're not currently, we don't feel like we're currently in that space.
So they're also lapsed.
In terms of the...
So as well as our trade waste, what was our 2015 one? The wastewater bylaw?
Yeah.
So the wastewater bylaw is lapsed currently.
Yeah,
and we are
lapsed in 2022.
2022. So we haven't served any wastewater notices in the last 2 years.
No.
Cool.
So I know it's trade waste questions, but I didn't see any mention and even in the document around the trade water supply. And I'm not talking about connection at the door, but the tankers that fill up at depots and stuff, Hoko Beach Road's one, and how that's captured if it's necessary to capture, because I don't see it at the moment.
We will pick up the water supply separately to this, but I suppose we'll almost link with that wet industry question as well around setting the framework around a user pay system as well. That in some ways the price could kind of be the influencing factor in the amount of quantity of and that would be a process that would likely sit through our fees and charges reviews. So we could certainly highlight that there's an interest in that water space.
So one of the biggest risks that we actually face in relation to trade waste at the moment, which I think is actually been highlighted already, is that we actually don't know what components or chemicals are coming from trade premises into our wastewater network, and therefore we don't actually know what damage it's causing to our assets, whether there's increased maintenance requirements, and also whether there's any health risks because of potential chemical reactions. At the moment, we've got the cost of this sitting on the general ratepayers rather than on trade companies, because right now we have 8 companies that we manage trade waste for. and we're currently working with those 8 companies to make sure that all their consents are current. So we also know that there are a significant number of other trade premises that we just don't know what's happening with managing their trade waste. We do also believe, based on anecdotal evidence, that we do have trade waste going into the general environment and into the stormwater. So, for example, we've found nickel in some of the stormwater networks in Levin, and based on where this has happened in other areas, it's possible that it's coming from a timber treatment facility, but we would need to be investigating this. When we look at the number of potential companies that we have, there are approximately 300 food production companies that are registered with HDC in relation to the Health Act, and this would just be a very rough guide of the number of food premises that should have a trade waste consent. This would be really important to actually prevent fat birds, which was that picture that was back earlier, and we would primarily be interested in their grease traps and making sure that they are working effectively. The other part of it is that our district, as we touched on, is looking at growing, and it will be much easier and more cost effective for companies to factor in what they need to do to pre-treat their trade waste while they're building, rather than trying to retrofit a solution. So other districts, when they've asked for retrofitting solutions, it's taken years and it's been really expensive for them. So we have some suggestions about tweaks that we could make to the bylaw to make things a little bit easier for people. The first, and this is all going alongside the idea that we are going to operationalise this bylaw. So the first thing that we want to know is we want to know where the businesses are, and we want to make sure that those that require consents have them. So what we're proposing is adding in an extra step where all businesses are required to register with us, and as part of that we would ask a couple of questions. At the moment, what businesses are required to do is actually figure out for themselves what category they are sitting in. So whether they have permitted trade waste, we've actually got 2 types of consented trade waste, which we are proposing to bring into one to make it a bit more user friendly. So it's either consented or conditional at the moment, or prohibited trade waste. So what we are proposing is that we take some of that pressure off businesses of having to decide where they sit for themselves, and we'll ask them to register. We'll ask a couple of questions, and then it will hopefully make it really clear, and we can sort them into whichever category they belong to. So the conditional trade waste, like I've said, that's up there, combines the previous categories of consented and conditional trade waste, because there's very little difference from the customer point of view, and we're actually also very unlikely to provide a consent that does not have any conditions on it. For example, we would have some form of monitoring condition there. We would then know what's coming into our wastewater network, and we can restrict, as part of those conditions on the consent, components that our wastewater system just can't handle for some reason. A new registration or consent would actually be required if a business operation changed. So, for example, if there were different chemicals or amounts of trade waste, or if the ownership or management of that site changed. That's actually within the current bylaw, so that's not too much of a change. But we are talking about making this process as easy and as cost effective as possible for businesses, while still giving us the information that we need to manage our wastewater system properly. So from the operational part of it, which is not really part of the bylaw, we would be looking at ways to streamline the consent processes. So for example, we would provide a different type of form that would streamline it for food production businesses, compared to, say, what a company like a large manufacturing company would need to provide us. There would be a significant difference in the amount of information required. So the next part that we're looking at within the trade waste is slightly widening the scope. So at the moment, our current bylaw is primarily concerned with trade premises that are connected directly to the public wastewater network, and these are the types of industries that are currently required in the bylaw to have a consent. So you're looking at food preparation, laundromats, automotive engineering, waste management, residential care, and also there is a requirement for temporary trade waste, for example, with construction projects where we're wanting to prevent sediment in particular or asbestos coming into our wastewater treatment facility. At the moment, there is a requirement for tankered waste companies to be registered with us or to hold a consent. What we are proposing as part of the changes is that the tankered waste company will hold a consent for domestic sewage and grease trap, the discharge from a grease trap. What we would then ask is that a trade premises where they have collected trade waste from, they would need to provide us with the consent of that other premises so that we then know what is turning up via a tankered waste measure and where it's from. There is currently a clause within our bylaw that says that we will only accept waste from within the Horowhenua district, but at the moment we don't have that operational process in place to put the checks and balances in place. And then that leaves us with the questions that are on the right side there. So the trade premises that are not connected to our wastewater network, we've just got a huge number of questions about them. So where are they discharging to? Are they handling it on site? Are they discharging it to the environment? Are they discharging it to the stormwater? And is it being taken away by tankered waste? So that links into what we're proposing here, where we're going to ask all companies to register with us so that we know, and then we can provide the appropriate consents to them. The other change that we are suggesting to make is in relation to grease traps, and so this is in line with what other councils have been doing. So, for example, Wellington and Central Hawke's Bay have prohibited the installation and use of grease converter type grease traps. What we would suggest is that where a business already has one installed, they would still be able to use it, but that we would prohibit new businesses from installing a grease converter. The reason is that while they can be very effective in controlled situations, in practical terms, we end up with a lot of grease, oil and fat going into our wastewater system from the use, because in real life it's a bit different to the controlled situations of the controlled environments when it's being tested. I can go a little bit more into how grease traps work, but if that's enough for people. We would also like to be looking at tightening some of the language used in relation to fees and invoices and monitoring. So we want to change some of the mays to shalls to provide certainty for what we will and will not charge for. The invoicing process at the moment is reasonably complex, and it's currently being completed manually in a spreadsheet. Quarterly invoicing is based on a fixed charge flow rate and then adjusted for the volumes of different components or chemicals in the network. It is reasonably difficult to explain to people what they would or wouldn't be being charged, and we would just like to try and make that a little bit clearer for people. And in terms of monitoring, council currently pays for monitoring, although there is a provision for this to be on charge to the appropriate consent holder. So we would just need to review how monitoring is managed and make sure that that cost is being borne by the right people or business. So again, part of that is about tightening the language. The last component that we wanted to talk about today, and this is there's a question here about whether this is something that we should explore further, is the topic of mortuary waste. So at the moment, what happens with mortuary waste is that primarily comes about from the embalming process, and body fluids and other components are added with a large volume of water and some other chemicals, and then that actually enters our wastewater network, treated in exactly the same way as other waste is. Some other councils have explored this further, and what you're seeing is an image of something that's called a Wisconsin mound. So Gisborne has, one of the councils in Gisborne has decided to treat mortuary waste with a Wisconsin mound that is in a cemetery there. And so what happens is the mortuary waste is held on site and then is tankered to this separate septic system, and so is treated very differently to the standard types of trade waste. The question that we're asking today is whether this is something that you would like us to explore further. We have not gone and spoken to anybody outside of council about this yet, and we would need to understand a lot more about the cultural impacts before we would be able to give some advice.
Kia ora, guys. I'm not going to talk about that one yet. I need to contemplate on that one. I just actually wanted to go back to the trade waste one, and there was a question mark underneath domestic sewage and grease, and I would like to see hazardous classified in there as well as hazardous substances. And what I'm quite aware of is that any vehicle that is required to carry any hazardous substance must have on board them a hazardous substance documentation, and so I think that's a tool that's already has to legally be used by operators, and it's probably a tool we should look at capturing as a part of our tracking of waste and the source and where it goes to scenario. So that's already a process that's legally has to be carried out by any operator, and they have to carry that satchel in the truck door, and it must be signed, and it has to be authentic, because if you're pulled up, your truck's immediately ordered off the road. The second one I wanted to raise was around cross-contamination, actually, and I'll relate it to fishermen and fisheries regulations and how we manage Dirimo. Fishermen are asked to clean their equipment before they move to another fishing area, and so I would like to ensure that we have a process by where our operators, as an example, if you were carting a hazardous toxic substance from a pharmaceutical outlet or a hospital or even a small tree, stuff that's here, that there's actually a process to decontaminate your vehicle before you move. Because I certainly wouldn't want a truck dumping mortuary waste turning up to my property and emptying my septic tank. Culturally, that would be completely insensitive for me. I can't say that for everybody, but that would be for me. So it's about how do we ensure that our operators have some understanding and level of commitment to that type of non-cross contamination. The other one I thought about is, would operators be open to sharing how they make up their charges? And it's just a question, because that might assist council in how we set fees, how our bylaw could look or shape in terms of what's required by them to get that product picked up and dispersed to the appropriate place. Because not all waste can be dumped at our treatment plant, I'm quite aware of that. Some waste is required to go to other regions and other areas to be appropriately dealt with. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to add for now. I'm still thinking about the mortuary one.
Just with the healthcare one, I imagine that includes vets, not just care for people. I wonder if it maybe sits in this last category where it's handled and removed elsewhere, but the Lion Labs, the manufacturer of vapes, by KFC, and sort of what that involves. I imagine most of their liquid actually makes the product rather than tipping it down sink, but there's obviously a washing process that goes on. So, that has been in the back of my mind for a while now, how that's dealt with. I don't know. Yeah, the other slides around I don't know. I'll think about the other thing, but even the way in which fees and charges are structured, for a later date, I guess.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point around the fees and charges. That is something that needs to come later, because that is the lever that council can manage, ensuring this doesn't become a burden on every small food premises, that there's actually an opportunity through this process to ensure, well, I suppose firstly, the fact that we're going from working with 8 contributors to requiring all businesses to register into a bylaw that's been in place since the early 90s. Like, this is what operationalising looks like. It's actually going out there, getting businesses to inform us of what they're doing, those that are connected, those that aren't. There could be impacts on some of the fast food chains, for example. They might have really good processes in place, but they still could be contributing into that wider burden that the community is obviously faced with. So that's really in some ways the operational side is fairly simplistic around registration. We'll be able to put some checks and balances around the cost impact and time frames to adhere to that. So I don't want it to come across like the earthquake prone building scenario, but in some ways there's a few similarities in the fact that we just haven't been addressing these or knowing the scale of these issues. But then we really flick over into the tankered waste scenario, that knowing what's happening within our region, we'll be able to close the loop in terms of audit processes and implementing what's been suggested around the waste track type systems, and then a subsequent question around fees and charges in that space as well. Because at the moment we are probably a little bit ambulance at the bottom of the cliff in terms of when a sample turns up and it goes into the plant, where the operators are there quite vigilantly scooping out a sample so that they can ensure that we haven't got things other than the domestic and grease track waste. But once it enters the plant and there's an issue, that can take some days to work through, and it's almost too late at that point. So it is very much about being more vigilant and active in the management of waste.
Can we add late payment penalties?
Yeah. We've got active, trade waste customers that do delay payment, and obviously without having late penalties and enforcing those, we're often treated as a bank. Yeah.
Sorry, Justine. I just on reading the
the bylaws, one of the sort of phrases that stood out for me was in the council's reasonable opinion, and it's a very obviously subjective view in terms of how we do it. So probably what I would like to see is some context of how that actually comes about, or who are the decision makers in terms of who is council's, who makes that opinion, and how, I suppose. I know there are, another sphere I operate in, it's about being careless and prudent and what the normal person would expect, and I would assume that is along the same lines, but some people may not agree with council's reasonable opinion, and I just wonder then what other steps or what other things that go into making that up, and what follows if people don't agree with it.
I think that's probably linked to the earlier comment around tidying up on language and versus could versus shall, and being a little bit clearer in that particular case. I think we'll try and remove as much subjectivity as possible, being clear around if you don't pay, this is the consequence, and leaving it up to less opinion. So I don't know that exact line that's been referenced, but expect that.
It's repeated a number of times, especially in the wastewater one.
So going forward, we are, provided that there's agreement about draft bylaws, we will be looking at community consultation January to March 2025. So given that we have a trade waste component, we are legally required to do 2 months of community consultation. We are also internally working towards having our processes and systems in place for the next financial year. So from July 2025, we'd be looking to be able to operationalise the bylaw fully. But we do have some questions that we will need to be developing a framework, and we will be coming back with these suggestions where we need to be looking at how do we do this without overwhelming our system, and how do we make sure it's fair, particularly for early adopters. What we've got here is a little bit of a time frame. We will be coming back to council again to talk about the water supply and stormwater components of the bylaw, and we will be getting a legal review on the bylaw as well. And we will be coming back about November is where we're planning at the moment to have a draft bylaw for council to look at.
Just before I guess we're finishing up here, I had some thinking around the mortuary one. I suppose they're just comments, they're not questions, but I didn't even know that stuff came through a treatment plant, and it's quite bizarre to hear that. But for me, I suppose I'm a Māori ward councillor, so I will raise an opinion really around it, that it definitely needs some cultural input into what that looks like or what it doesn't look like. I like the option that you shared there back that Gisborne do potentially about a separation of type materials. It's very tapu for Māori, I'll put it that way. We're talking about bodily fluids, we're talking about blood, we're even talking about remnants from crematoriums and other things. And unlike waste that comes from a home that goes through piping system and is watered down through lots and lots of water moving through our system, these products actually arrive at our plant in bulk, and they're very not watered down, as an example. And then we treat that material, and we then pipe that material out onto land, and then that material ends up in waterways, streams, and potentially within food sources. And so I won't say any more than that, but just to share that it's a significant issue for myself. I don't know how others might feel about it, but I definitely think heavy consultation around that for me would be useful. Yeah, it's certainly to understand others' opinions around it as well. So that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I think top of our list around engagement with iwi hapu would certainly be this aspect, and anecdotally from referencing other communities, particularly where there's direct discharge back into a waterway versus with council discharge to land, but it's not to say that that's an appropriate process, and that we do need to seek guidance on what could be put in place, ultimately to inform a decision for council to move to prohibition. So it feels like there isn't a it's a yes or no around accepting of that process and setting some pretty clear guidelines. So consultation with the businesses involved, but certainly with iwi hapu will be an important aspect that we'll bring back to the table for an elected member decision point post consultation. So we're hoping we've answered the questions today around should we continue drafting one local water bylaw, noting that we will come back with the stormwater and water components. Agreement is really in part around the wastewater focus, the trade waste. I suppose wanting to have an awareness today that there's some bylaws that have lapsed. The prospect that when we committed to generate further revenue through the long-term plan in the trade waste sector, that it wasn't just about upping the levies on the 8 premises. It was around taking that holistic approach to understand how all businesses are contributing and managing their trade waste across the region. So that is going to require what feels like quite a process-orientated approach to force registration and compliance, and ultimately post-education. But the levers for council will sit around fees and charges and time frame for implementation. And then one of the overarching principles around being a lot more clear so that we're not conflicting with other policies, and also for new businesses that are coming, whether they're wet industries or a new fish and chip shop, that they're quite clear on day one of how they should be setting up to do business in our community. So unless there was any further questions, this sort of was really just a touch point to share that there's some work happening and that it will look quite different to what we're currently doing, but albeit the words in the bylaw aren't necessary. The issue is it's around that consistency and implementation.
Yeah, I had some queries about the combining of them and the negative implications of this in terms of needing a 2-month consultation for trade waste. If in future council want to change something in their freshwater bylaw and then we've combined them, do we need to do a 2-month consultation to make a minor change in future? Is it more convenient to have them separate for future changes, is my thought? Are we kind of hampering ourselves and the limited powers we have by combining them?
So we can make minor changes without going through full consultation. So we can make little changes. Yes, if there are large changes in the future, we could split these parts back out if we wanted to. So we've proposed bringing them together. Part of the reason for that is when you look at wastewater, for example, we need to have the same prohibited characteristics between the wastewater bylaw that are in the trade waste bylaw, and that's where if we look at these separately, which we have done in the past, and it has led to a level of perhaps confusion for probably more of the community rather than anything else, where we've ended up with problems with people thinking that trade waste is a component of solid waste rather than wastewater, which it's obviously not. If we look at these together, then we can make sure that we're continuing continuing that path. But we can split them out. We can have a series of 4 that are reviewed at the same time. What that would then do is, in the future, if we looked at one separately, it would then be out of sync with the reviews for the other ones.
Yeah, I think we can also come back at our next touch point to decide when the final point of opportunity to split those back out would be, and it might be that, and some of the pros and cons around that, but I suppose the key message at the moment is that we need to look at all of them at once to ensure there's some alignment and with everything else that sits around them. So we're not, haven't identified any significant challenges, but appreciate the question, and we can do some further thinking on that.
Yeah, agree if they should all be aligned. The fact that they have different definitions is bad and wrong, and yes, that's a problem. I don't think the solution is combining them. I think the solution would have been not making that mistake initially.
Yeah, don't disagree with that. Yeah.
The trade waste approach with the whole registration process, I I can just imagine some businesses a little bit apprehensive about what that means, because obviously they'd be exposing themselves in some way, and some can afford it and some can't, if you know what I mean. At the same time, I wondered, in order to alleviate that perhaps there is a threshold on how much impact a particular business is having towards the network. I don't know how that would practically work out, even if it could. But there might be a minor versus a major or something to that effect, where it determines, because you got your businesses like sole traders versus companies versus small, medium, large, and sort of it's sizable sort of what they're putting out into our network difference.
So I'm wondering if what you're talking about is the permitted trade waste that's there. So permitted trade waste is predominantly waste that is very similar to domestic waste. So an office building would be permitted trade waste, a retail store, permitted trade waste. Where we've got the issue at the moment is that we just don't know. So if we found that we did some testing in our wastewater network and we found that there was a component there that we didn't know where it had come from, what we don't know is at the moment is which businesses along that path have trade waste that should be consented. If we had all the businesses registered at a high level, we can then quite easily see what's going on and we can focus our efforts into where we need to. Other councils have done this, so one place that has done this is Central Hawke's Bay, and it seems to have worked quite well for them. But we can, the option of removing that registration process is that we can ask people again to sort themselves into the 3 categories. So are they permitted trade waste, are they conditional trade waste, or are they prohibited? We just thought that by adding in a registration step, we could take some of the pressure off determining that from the businesses and put it onto council instead. But we can remove that requirement to register.
Yeah, I think just highlighting that it's that apprehension. So in some ways we need to remove barriers to that in terms of cost or effort. But to be perfectly honest, if there is someone who is apprehensive because they don't feel like they are compliant, that's actually the people that we do want to identify in the process. So we've probably got a limited tolerance for that. What we will do is, with guidance from elected members in that fees and charging space, is try and incentivise informing us of what's in the system that allows, like Justine's pointed out, to have an oversight if there was something to appear. We can then work with them in the education space and ideally make that as easy and as cost effective as possible, particularly for those smaller business owners. We would assume that would be the appetite and directed from elected members. But if there is someone that is clearly non-compliant, they're dragging the chain with registration, then we'd probably start to ask some questions anyway in that space. So, yeah.
Yes, the point I was going to make that issue was I totally support registration because we should know what's going into our plant and who's contributing to it and are they paying their share for it, not being carried by the rest of the district in terms of the ratepayers. So totally support it. By and large, support the combining of the bylaw makes absolute sense. Noting Brogan's point, which was a good one, that I know you'll consider. It makes absolute sense to do that. So looking forward to the next tranche of work, and thanks, Justine. Really good.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Justine. That's I actually quite enjoyed that conversation. It was good and well done. Just one comment. I suppose it would have been nice if we'd had the presentation maybe yesterday or something, at least to be able to understand some of those changes you were talking about to understand it. But yeah, look, great work. Thank you.
Yeah, apologies. It was only this morning it dawned on me that you hadn't received that. So yeah, ideally, yeah, we'll certainly do that for the next one. It was prepared well in advance. So yeah, can acknowledge, take that on the chin. Yeah. And we haven't delivered on the spot quiz either because we've run out of time.
So we've got the Foxton Te Awahou Community Board coming at 4:00, but we're going to use the time now to have an update on the plan on page priorities and things which Sam's going to lead, and then